right, it's so good to see each and every one of you tonight. Looking forward as we continue on with our lesson in Exodus. We talked a little bit about kind of the introduction to Moses' life in general and also the introduction to the book of Exodus. If you were here several weeks ago, I guess, before our summer series, we wrapped up the book of Genesis. And so we're kind of continuing on that narrative from Genesis where Joseph and his family go down into Egypt. And then Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 picks right back up with going back to the going of the children of Israel, literally the 12 sons of Israel, going to the land of Egypt and them living there. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the situation that was around the birth of Moses, who was born in darkness, just kind of like what we talked about tonight during our devotional. And so as we begin, the first section that we're going to see is verses 1 through 14, which really highlight Israel's rapid growth. We see in the end of Genesis and at the beginning of Exodus, there are 70 people, so it says, that went down into the land of Egypt. And then after 400 years, several generations, we're going to see that's going to explode into a nation of well over 1 million people, according to the counting of what we're told in the book of Exodus and also in Numbers. And so let's go ahead and dive right in, not knowing how long our first lesson will take, so go ahead and use all of our time together. Let's look at verses 1 through 14. Exodus 1 through 14. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each of his own household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And so here we see in verses 1 through 14 that despite the circumstances in which Israel finds itself, Israel the nation, not the man, they grow rapidly. One of the blessings in the ancient world, how you measured wealth, was the number of children that you had. I was talking with Miss Ruth Sweeney today. We went visiting, and Miss Ruth was one of 5. She was one of 5 all girls. She had 5 children, all boys. And I said, "Miss Ruth, you were trying to balance the scales out a little bit, right? You were one of 5 all girls and had 5 boys, and obviously one of her sons, Ricky, is a faithful member of the congregation." Then I was talking to the other members. It seems kind of natural for older generations to have more individuals. Obviously, I'm looking at Brother Ed and Brother Austin here, both from very large families. My mom is one of 5. My dad is one of 5. You look at somebody with 5 kids now, and you're like, I don't want to be crude, but do you know what causes that? Like, it's just, like you got 5 kids, right? And, back when my mom was growing up, 5 kids was kind of normal, right? I mean, it's just, big. I mean, she also grew up in an agricultural place, so the more kids you had, the more free labor you also had too. So there's probably something to go along with that also. But in the ancient world, being fruitful and having a multitude of children was seen as a blessing from God. And here you see that correspondence here. God is blessing the nation of Israel, and those blessings are coming about through childbirth. Because the more children that you have, the more workers that you have, the more wealth that you can acquire, the more arms you have, literally, whenever there's a war breaks out. And so it's a sense of wealth, but it's also a sense of protection. Now, the Bible tells us something quite interesting in this text about this new Pharaoh that comes to power. And what is that? He did not know Joseph. Now, this can mean one of 2 things, right? I mean, how many years have passed by since this new Pharaoh comes to power? Right? If we go with the Bible counting of 400 years, right, that they are in Egypt, and Moses is 80 whenever he leads the people of Israel out, and this is before he is born. We take 80, we minus 80 from 400, and we get about 300 roughly, right? And so it's been about 300 years since Joseph has been there. And so two things, right? Either he just obviously doesn't know who Joseph is because it's been 300 years, and Joseph was a very important figure in the Egyptian political society at that time, but he was not Pharaoh himself. Or it could be something a little bit different, which I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hyksos. Was this a different dynasty? Did the Hyksos have a role to play? Or was it simply just removed by time? Now, the Hyksos are something that we know from Egyptian history. They were a Semitic people. Now, who else is a Semitic people? The Jews, right? The Israelites are Semitic people, right? Oftentimes you hear a term anti-Semitic, right? So today we really only refer to Jews as being Semitic, but technically so are most of the Arabs in that area in the Middle East, technically from this standpoint. But the Hyksos were a Semitic people. Now, we get that from the Semitic languages, which seem to be descendants from the line of Shem from Noah. And so most of the time, these people are going to be towards the other side of the Euphrates, which is more like your Babylonians and your Akkadians, which makes sense because where was Abraham from? Yeah, the Babylonian area, right? It's going to be a while before the Babylonians come to power. We think of what the Babylonian Empire, but basically right? You know, the Chaldeans. The Babylonians ethnically is what the Israelites come from. And so they're a different ethnicity than the Egyptians, right? And so the Hyksos would have been from this same family. Now, we don't know how, why, exactly when, but we do know before the 18th dynasty, in about 1670 to 1550, that during this time a Semitic people, we don't know if there was any relation to the Phoenicians, the Sea peoples that are oftentimes mentioned in ancient Egyptian texts, if these were a group of nomadic settlers, kind of like Abraham, if this was a group of people from the Akkadian area. We simply don't know. But we do know it was a Semitic people that came into Egypt, and by force or by cunningness or whatever, they rise to power and literally rule Egypt as pharaohs for over 100 years. This is really interesting because during this rule of 100 years, plus or minus, where are the Israelites? In Egypt, right? And so if we're going with the biblical counting, Joseph is there in about 1850. Moses leads the people out around 1450. And so smack dab in the middle of this, you get foreign invaders that rule the most powerful and largest civilization in the ancient world for about 100 years. Then the 18th dynasty comes to power. Does anybody remember how many dynasties I talked about last week or 2 weeks ago in the Egyptian history? 32 dynasties, right? It's a bunch. Well, before the 18th dynasty gets to power, you have these Hyksos, right? And so when the 18th dynasty comes to power, it could have been that the throne has changed dynasties at least twice since Joseph has been in power. So there could be a real... It could really be that the Pharaoh just doesn't know who Joseph is. It's been 300 years and the dynasties have changed twice. I mean, they've just been ruled by a foreign power for over 100 years. So there's a lot been going on in the history of the Egyptians, which also helps to explain the animosity towards the Israelites, right? Because we were just ruled by Semitic people, meaning, and I think Hyksos may mean like shepherd kings, right? And so what are the Israelites? They're shepherds. They're Semitic shepherds, right? So you might understand why the Pharaoh is looking at this very large growing population of Semitic shepherds, right, in his kingdom, looking at them saying, if we are ever attacked by an outside force, I'm not so sure if we can trust these guys. And understanding what takes place in Egyptian history before this Pharaoh comes to power with these Semitic shepherds usurping the Egyptians and coming to power for over 100 years, you kind of understand a little bit more as to why the Pharaoh might be concerned with this group of foreigners in his midst, right? In the ancient world, especially in siege warfare, the biggest threat that you have is somebody on the inside opening the doors to the conquering army. Well, if you've got this growing population of foreigners in your midst, that becomes a serious threat in your kingdom. And so this would explain the animosity towards Israelites because the Hyksos were a Semitic people like the Israelites. When the Egyptians retook the throne back from the Hyksos, they might have grouped the Israelites in with their disdain because that they were the same ethnically and they could see them as potential usurpers. If you do the late date of the Exodus 1290, which is the one used by the movie 10 Commandments they play every Easter, Charleston Heston, then Seti is we've got it here. No. Then Seti, the first, is the king of the oppression, and Ramses the second is the king of the Exodus. I take the later date, which is around 1450, which would put probably Tutmos the fourth as the Pharaoh of the oppression, mentioned here in chapter 1, and Amenhotep the second as the Pharaoh. Now, that may or may not be the case. People argue that all the time, but that's just my for what it's worth, which is not very much at all. That's who I'm going with, so I'm betting on. And so you have a very, very large population. Now, 600,000 people is a lot of people. We're told in Exodus 12:37 that when the Exodus takes place, which is going to be a generation from now, actually 2 generations, which is going to take place in 80 years from when Moses is born, that there's 600,000 men over the age of 20, which is going to place the population of the entire nation of Israel well over 1 million people. Now, critics would argue and say that's just simply too many people for the Israelites. Despite the fact there's 400 years, despite the fact that God is with them, that's just too large of a population boom to have happened historically. We don't know this, right? Because there's all types of things that take place. In fact, if God was going to put his people in an area for them to grow rapidly in a 400-year time frame, there's no better place in the ancient world than Egypt. If Abraham would have stayed in Canaan, right? If God's people would have stayed there, you have multiple tribes who are always roaming around trying to find food for their livestock, and they're fighting all the time. Right? Even when Abraham and Isaac are there, what do they fight over all the time? Wells, right? Water. They're fighting over wells all the time, right? When the Israelites leave 400 years later and take the land, how many different nations are they fighting? Several, right? I mean, you got all types of nations, and they're at war with each other. And so it's a very volatile place, even in Abraham and Isaac's day. So where are you going to put these people for them to grow and not be molested too bad? I'm not saying slavery is great, but you send them to the most powerful, wealthiest country in the world at that time. So they go to Israel, and even though the text tells us they're oppressed, even the Israelites themselves would look back at their time in Egypt with fondness, especially when it came to food. And so in Exodus chapter 16, verse 3, it talks about when the Israelites were in Egypt and they had the free pots full of meat. In Numbers 11:5, it says they had fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, garlic, and onions. And so you have Israel put into a location where they don't have to worry about foreign wars, because nobody's going to attack Egypt, so they're not going to have to lose any manpower in battle. Egypt had the most sophisticated civilization at that time. We have found mummies going back to this time frame that have had surgery on them. Even removing parts of their scalp whenever they had head trauma in order to allow their brains to swell. It's incredible, right? I mean, we're talking about, almost 4,000 years ago, and it really is interesting to see how God put his people in Israel. Even though the Israelites could look at their time as being enslaved for 400 years, why is God doing this to us? It was better than any other place in the ancient world they could have been, and also allowed for them to grow rapidly and increasingly. Any questions or comments, concerns on yes?
Well, I'm sure it don't say nowhere, but they was born in bondage. They're born slaves. I wonder at what age did they make them start working every day, or with 5, 6, 7,
Yeah.
Did they have them doing it?
Well, I can tell you about my parents, right? My mom's over here. I don't know. It's a great question, right? And so I obviously wasn't a slave. But when I was a kid, I wanted to be out with everybody else, in the fields until they would take a hoe and cut it in half. And I'd be out there in my little hoe, playing the dirt basically, or dropping sticks whenever it was cutting time. Everybody ever dropped sticks, cutting the bike and stuff? I can remember, I don't know how old I was, but I can remember when I went from being able to carry 2 sticks to 3 sticks. And just thinking I was a man. It's like I'm not a boy anymore. I carry 3 sticks now. It's like carry 3 sticks in one hand now. But so I don't. That's a good question. I don't know.
It started pretty early.
Probably pretty early, right? Yeah, and slavery in the ancient world is different than what we think about as slavery today. I mean, our minds have been tainted a little bit with American slavery in the 17th through 19th centuries. In the ancient world, slavery was extremely common. In fact, over half the people in the Roman Empire would have been considered slaves, and so. It's an interesting dynamic, like you were saying, James. Honestly, I don't know. I'm thinking at least maybe 10, 11, 12. But I mean, that's just a guess, thinking about just the human body maturing and when you can really get some good work out of somebody. The kids today are soft. We can't even get good 40 hours a week out of a 12-year-old anymore. You know what I'm saying? All these video games.
Feeding animals and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about even in some of your own lives, whenever when y'all were raised hard, and stuff like that. You were expected to do things, right? I mean, I was talking to someone the other day that went to, I think it was maybe Etheridge, where they have the Amish farms and stuff. And he was just amazed because he wanted some cucumbers or I don't know what it was, some tomato, I don't know what it was. And he said there was a little boy behind the counter, who was like 3 years old. And he was like, go get a basket or whatever. And he said that little 3-year-old boy jumped down and ran and came back in there and he'd pick some tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever, but kids are smart. I mean, if you expect something out of a kid, they kind of adapt pretty well, right? And I think maybe in the older societies, they kind of expect their kids, more. I'll tell one on Remy, since Remy's not here, not listening, but Gary and Brandy. 2 weeks ago, Brandy, I told him, I called Brandy Candy 12 times. I knew the whole time what her name was. But they were telling me about Remy, and Remy's just turned 5, and she gets up in the mornings, and she goes and she picks the eggs out of the chicken house. And she goes and what else does she do? She goes and she picks the cherry tomatoes. And she picks the cherry tomatoes. She does all these chores, and she was telling me all that she does when she wakes up. I'm like, that's more than what I do when I wake up. This little 5-year-old girl out here outworking me, And but they have that kind of that expectation. So that was a really long way to say I have no idea, James. It's a good question though. I just don't know. But yeah.
I mean, by reading Isaac, there was likely a king between Joseph, Pharaoh, and his king. We knew the time frame, right?
Oh yeah, no, between.
And because they were honored guests at one point, so how do you go from honored guests to slave? They wake up when he became the new king. Did he just say, "Okay, all you people living here, you're now"?
No, I don't think so. I think it was probably several kings, because there's a 300-year gap from Joseph dying to Moses being 275 to 315 roughly, and so there's probably at least 5, maybe even 10, and then you get the transition between Egyptian pharaohs usurping Semitic pharaohs by the Hyksos, and then the 18th dynasty begins. And so between Joseph and what we're told about here in Exodus 1, there could have been as many as 10 pharaohs.
And so they were likely slaves before this. He just made it much tougher.
Right, exactly. And like I said, most people in the ancient world were slaves. And so even being a slave in the ancient world wasn't seen as much as disdain as we think of it as. I'm trying to think if you're a teacher, I mean, up until our modern world, I mean, that was a slave job. I mean, if you're an artist, I mean, that's a slave job. If you're a merchant, unless you own the merchant company, I mean, that's a slave job. If you're in healthcare, that's a slave job. I mean, most of our jobs that we think today as being middle class in the ancient world is slave jobs. Because but we think of slaves as out hoeing the corn, and as menial, like slave labor we think of today is a little bit different in the ancient world. Whereas it would be a much broader envelope, I guess you would say, than what maybe sometimes we think about today. But yes, I think they were probably already somewhat slaves or enslaved, and then they just were making it more oppressed, like you were saying here. They're just trying intensifying the workload and the difficulty and stuff like that.
I mean, hadn't they basically sold themselves into slavery? When the food shortage came, once after they got rid of everything else, it was just themselves that they had to sell, right? Yeah,
just like Matt was saying, in ancient Egyptian society, the Pharaoh was a little bit different because Pharaoh was seen to be a demigod that owned everything, right? Basically, like Matt was saying, pretty much the entire country was somewhat slaves. And that's what the Bible tells us at the end of Genesis, right? That each year during the famine, they come and they sell their stuff, then they sell themselves, right, into slavery in order to get food. And so the Bible tells us that's how Pharaoh becomes like the owner of everything in Egypt, including the people. And so now it seemed like Joseph may have been exempt from that, but when his family gets there, it may have been pretty easy for these people to kind of fall into that, And then when they drive the Hyksos out, these Semitic usurpers, it could have been that they could have been the root of oppression. I mean, think of the idea of they were associating them because of their language and their skin color with the 9/11 attacks, right? Well, it's kind of a similar idea here, right? I mean, the Israelites would have looked like the Hyksos and sounded like the Hyksos, and so they may have been grouped with this disdain for the Hyksos towards the Israelites. Makes sense. The text doesn't tell us that, but to me it makes pretty logical sense. All right, we got bogged down with that. I'm going to move on. Exodus 15 through 22. So Pharaoh's evil plan. So let's look at verses 15 through 22. Then the king of Egypt said to Hebrew midwives, one of them was named Siphrah, and the other name was Puah, and when you serve as a midwife to Hebrew women, and you see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if a daughter, you shall let her live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. And so you have here Pharaoh's evil plan. He charges the the Hebrew midwives to kill the male children. Now, why just the male children?
Those are the ones who fight wars.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah. And what's the motivation here? What's the fear? Verses 1 through 14 already tells us what the fear is. That's right. If there's a military fight, and the wives in the ancient world, you are what your dad was. Right? I mean, if your mom's American and your dad's German and you're born, guess what you are? You're German, right? In the ancient world, you are what your dad is. And so, these women, they are future carriers of Egyptian sons, right? So, I mean, we can bear sons and children with them. Don't kill them, but kill the boys. And so, the midwives refuse to do that. They refuse to kill them. And they say the Israelite women are better at birthing, right? They're more vigorous in childbirth. Ironically, there's been actual archaeological evidence to show that Egyptian women, just in their body shape, was actually taller and larger, and they're just bigger ladies, I guess you would say, And so some have said that maybe that was, kind of a play on words. Maybe it wasn't, but that was actually something that I read, that some archaeological finds had found that the Israelite ladies were a little bit bigger than the Egyptian women.
Probably did harder work than the other women that were rich and laid around and ate bread.
That's right. I mean, like Miss Susan said, they were a little bit tougher, right? They'd been out in the sun and working, and especially if they're slaves at this point, and so maybe were more. They were conditioned for childbirth, right? They had prepared themselves. So God blesses the midwives because they refuse to kill the children. Even the midwives 4,000 years ago, we like to think that people in the ancient world were stupid, were primitive, were dumb, and that we're so much smarter because we have smartphones, which is so pompous and arrogant of us. The average person in the ancient world was probably much smarter than we are today because the comforts of life have made us complacent. It's like, well, I can send an email to China, so I'm smart. It's like, well, you explain the internet. Because I can't, right? So if it all goes down tomorrow, I can't send anything to China, right? And so, but even 4,000 years ago, people could realize that a child is precious and shouldn't be murdered. And now we have people cheering while people are on stage on TV saying that you should be able to murder an infant child. Soapbox for today. I'm going to visit that again probably in about 3 minutes. But anyways, and so God blesses the midwives because they can understand the sanctity of life because they're not willing to be pressured even by the most powerful man in the world at this point to kill innocent children. And so God blesses them because they don't do that. Any questions or comments on verses 15 through 22? Once again, Gleason Archer writes an article on the Pharaohs of the Old Testament, and he's the one that suggests Tutmosis III is that Pharaoh during the oppression, and then Amenhotep II. Now, there is some pharaohs in between, obviously, because there's at least 80 years separated between the birth of Moses and the Exodus. And so Gleason Archer does much more work on trying to figure out who it is, and so his article is pretty convincing. So that's who I'm going to match up with for the current time being. Any questions on 15 through 22? Right, good. Let's get through verses 1 through 10 because I really want us to spend some time here. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as a wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw the son was a fine child or a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him in a basket made of bulrushes and pitched it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river whilst the young woman walked beside the river. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant women, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. And she took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then the sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." And so verses 1 through 10, we have the birth of Moses. Oh, if Tutmosis IV is the Pharaoh during the oppression, this is his face. We've actually found his sarcophagus, and this is his preserved body. So if it is, this is what the guy looked like, that was wanting to kill the Hebrew babies. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. And so the birth of Moses in verses 1 through 10, he's born into the tribe of Levi. Why is this going to be important later on? Yeah, if Moses is a Levi, Aaron's a Levi, right? Moses is a priest and Aaron is the high priest. And we're going to establish that the high priest and the priest come from the tribe of Levi. Now, what is Moses' mom and dad's name? Jochebed? Amram. You didn't get it from Exodus 2 though, did you? It's interesting, right? We get the story of this man and this Levite woman, and we're not told their name until Exodus 6:20, right? Who's the sister? You didn't get that from Exodus 2, right? Her name isn't given to us until Exodus 15:20. And so it's interesting, right? Because who's the main character in the situation? God, but Moses, right? I'll accept Moses, right? The main character really is God, right? And his providence. God's the one who is multiplying the people, right? And God is the one who's going to make Pharaoh pay for the future delivery of his own people out of Pharaoh's treasury, right? The Pharaoh's daughter ain't got a job. Where's she getting her money? Daddy, right? So Pharaoh's over here telling people to kill the Hebrew slave children, right? And he's actually paying for Moses to be nursed by his own Hebrew mom. Think about that for a second. That's what you call the providence of God, right? And being with his people. I mean, that's incredible. But he's born. The mom sees that he is a beautiful child. How many of you moms out there thought your child was beautiful? Right? A few of you, right? Some of you feel guilty because you feel like I've got to raise my hand. I don't know. So you've got something in common with Jochebed, that she thought Moses was a beautiful child. Hides him for 3 months. Why is she hiding him?
He's supposed to have been dead.
Right, verse 22, right? Pharaoh has issued a decree that all Egyptian people are supposed to be looking for Hebrew babies to throw the Nile River, right? And so every good Egyptian is supposed to be looking for babies to throw in the river. And so she's hiding Moses. She puts Moses in an ark. The Hebrew word there is theba. It's the same word used for Noah and the ark. Now, obviously, Noah's ark is a lot different than Moses' ark. But I think that the inspired writer is trying to show us this connection between God saving Noah and his family in the ark, and then God saving Moses and ultimately the people of God through this ark. And so, very similar. If you watch the Ten Commandments or you watch the recent illustration, Jochebed puts Moses into the water and pushes it, and it floats down the stream, and it finds Pharaoh's daughter bathing. But if you read the text in Exodus 2, what does it seem more like? Yeah, it seems like she hid it, right? Which makes you wonder, did she just hide it in a certain place? Did she know that Pharaoh's daughter would often come and bathe in this particular spot? And she's kind of scoped it out and realizes it and knows, and that's why she puts it here? Obviously, the text doesn't say, so anything that we discuss is speculation, right? But it is kind of interesting to think about, would you put your baby in a random spot? I wouldn't, but I'm not there, right? So it could be that she is, thinking about where can I put this child to keep it safe.
Obviously, I would say wouldn't say that you necessarily could say it was where Pharaoh's daughter, but it's probably where Egyptian women bathe, not necessarily just Pharaoh's daughter. And you know that there has to be some people there because she wouldn't put Miriam there to watch over it to see what happened.
Yeah.
So there's something about that. I would almost bet, because the Egyptians were like the Hebrews in a way. They understood if you didn't bathe where you would use the same water to clean and drink and stuff. They were a little bit more up on hygiene than others. And so this is probably more of a common area where just the Egyptian women went to clean themselves. Not necessarily just the queen or the princess.
I would agree with Todd. Either way, I think that the depiction of the basket floating down the Nile River is, not what we see here. And I think that there is, whether knowing that the Egyptian ladies are going to be here or even a specific person, it seems like there's something there to that. One of the cool and interesting things that I see here. Miriam watches over the basket and tells Pharaoh's daughter that she can find a nurse for him. And so to me, it's just so amazing that Moses is able to be nursed by his mom. In the ancient world, the weaning process would have lasted between the ages of 2 and 4. The fact that he's not going to be in his own physical mom's presence, he's probably closer to like 4 to 5 years old, being raised with his mom. So, I mean, imagine you being a mom of Moses and putting him in a river thinking you've got to say goodbye at 3 months old. And then through the providence of God, you get to keep that child in your home day after day until he's at least probably 4 to 6 years old. To me, that would be very, very important and special to spend that time with your child. Also, love Charleston Heston's 10 Commandments, but, it probably wasn't a big surprise to him as an adult that he was a Hebrew. He probably knew that from the time he was a small child and knew that his entire life. One of the things that is really cool is that she names Moses, and the Bible tells us she did that because of the Hebrew phrase, mashah, which means to draw out of water. But here's my question. If you look at Moses, and I have it on here? Yes, sorry. Moses is an Egyptian name, right? We talked about Tutmos. The second part of his name in Egypt is Moses, and it means to be born of or the son of. Moses is an Egyptian name. And so, but here we're told that he's named because of the Hebrew word to draw out of water. My question is, why would an Egyptian princess name Moses by a Hebrew word? it's just interesting, right? I've got no answer from the Bible. The Bible tells us she names him because of the Hebrew to draw out of water. My question is, why does an Egyptian princess name this baby with a Hebrew name? But that Hebrew name also happens to be extremely similar to an Egyptian name, right? Now.
Maybe that was her light of life.
Mother?
Do what?
Don't you think his mother might have said, let's name him Moses?
Well, it says here the Pharaoh named Moses. Now, I'm going to give you some sci-fi. This is not gospel. This is not Bible. This is just Isaac trying to make a really interesting movie in his head, right? We already know the Pharaoh has decided that Hebrew girls are good to bear sons with. Maybe it's not out of the realm of possibilities that maybe that she has either Hebrew slaves, maybe this Egyptian princess. I mean, maybe she's got Hebrew. Maybe she's half Hebrew. I mean, like I said, this is my mind just playing games and going 50 Shades. There's all kinds of stuff. Like where's this going? All right. She picks a name, right, that is both Egyptian and Hebrew, right? There's nuance there. And it could be a royal, because if you look at one of the most common royal names, this is a royal girl, right, who is adopting this child as her son. And she gives him a super common name in Egyptian royalty, but also corresponds to the water in Hebrew. So I just think that maybe she knew both Egyptian and Hebrew languages and picked a name that would kind of be nuanced to go with both. Now, whether you want to say that she knew Hebrew, at least she knew at least one Hebrew word. I mean, to draw out of water. Or maybe she knew both languages. Now,
I mean, being the Pharaoh's daughter, I'm sure she'd be like as highly educated of people of that time. I mean,
most people in the ancient world knew multiple languages. If Hebrews are slaves, maybe she's got Hebrew slaves. Right? I mean, so she doesn't have to have some sort of Hebrew connection, at least from her own personal life, but maybe she's, like you said, maybe she's educated and knows the language of Hebrews, right? So, good question. We don't know. So that was just...
I think recognizing that the child's Hebrew, what's the rule for any Egyptian to do? They found a Hebrew son?
Throw in the Nile.
So... she's going to have to somehow save this child by going against dad. Yeah. And so she's going to have to do something. So the best way to hide, we don't know if Pharaoh knew he was Hebrew or not.
Yeah. That's to me the interesting thing is that why does an Egyptian woman name him a Hebrew name? Or why does she choose to name him Moses? Because of the Hebrew word to draw out, right? So to me that's the question mark that is so intriguing in my mind. Is
I think she thought he was Hebrew because she got him.
Yeah, but what makes it so interesting is the fact that Moses is an Egyptian name. Does that make sense? And so she picks a name. Like, just the wit to be able, maybe it was inspired, I don't know, but just the wit to be able to pick a name that works both in Hebrew and Egyptian, two different languages, right? And it works so well. It's just interesting.
That could make the Pharaoh a little suspicious of drawing out of the water. They're going to be dead in the water, and then the name means drawing out of the water.
Well, she could just say his name is Moses, just like your name's Moses. Tutmosis. I mean, that's his name. We say Tutmos or Amos, but it's the same name. Well, not in Egyptian, doesn't. In Egyptian, it means the son of or to be born of. That's what I'm saying. That's what it works in both languages, which is like, that's what's so interesting about it. Grace, we don't know. We'll never know until we get to heaven, right? It's just something I think is kind of cool, interesting. Verse 6, right? Why does she not kill the baby? Why? Pity, right? One last time to get on my abortion soapbox, right? You have the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh who's trying to kill babies, looks at a crying child, and has pity. Abortion clinics in the U.S. try as much as they can for women not to see the ultrasound pictures. Why? Because if they see the ultrasound picture, the likelihood of them having an abortion decreases by multiple variables. And so there's something about seeing a crying child, right, that touches this Egyptian princess. She's heard the decree from dad, but as she's faced with this precious crying child, she can't throw it in the water, right? She's got to save it. And so something to be said for, the sanctity of life. Number one, some takeaways that we have: you cannot hinder God's plan. God's plan was for the Israelites to be saved, and so instead of the Nile being used as an instrument of death, God uses the Nile as an instrument of salvation, both for Moses and ultimately the Israelite people. Number two, the importance of women. One of the things you see so far is how important women play, especially in the preservation of life. You have Jochebed, you have Miriam, you have Pharaoh's daughter. Later we're going to see, you're going to have Jethro's daughters with Moses later on. You're going to have Zipporah with Gershom and his circumcision. The similarities of Christ and Moses, many of you have heard that sermon before, but it is quite interesting. And then number four, God's providential care. The Israelites are in the midst of slavery, and yet God is using it to fortify them as a nation and to help grow them and strengthen them to this nation that's going to take the promised land in a few generations. Sorry we don't have time for comments and questions. I spent too much time in speculation tonight. I apologize. I won't do that as much anymore. And let's go ahead and let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for all many blessings you've given us. We're so thankful for the opportunity we have to come together in Bible study with those of like mind and like faith. Dear Heavenly Father, as we look towards your providential hand in Exodus 1 and 2 and the life of Moses and the Israelites, please help us to also look at our own lives, of your loving kindness towards us and your providential love and care in our own lives, how you have strove to make a way for us to be faithful in your service. And dear Heavenly Father, please help us realize that as we live here in this life, there will be hardships, that we will have adversaries against us, both in spiritual terms and also in the flesh. Help us to be those who persevere in faith and who are found faithful in your service. This in your Son's name we pray. Amen.